Over the sun-scorched airfield of Benghazi, Libya, on the morning of June 15, 1942, Captain Antonio Marconi of the Regia Aeronautica watched his wingman's Machi 200 fighter spiral into the desert below, trailing black smoke from an engine that had simply torn itself apart at 8,000 meters. The pilot survived the landing, but his aircraft was the third lost that week to inexplicable engine failures, and Marconi could no longer dismiss these incidents as mere mechanical misfortune. What neither he nor his fellow pilots yet understood was that the answer to their mounting losses had nothing to do with combat prowess or maintenance procedures, and everything to do with what they were pouring into their fuel tanks. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. In the months that followed, a captured British fuel depot would reveal a truth so devastating that it would fundamentally change how Italian aviators understood their own defeats, forcing them to confront the reality that they had been losing a war not in the skies, but at the refineries. The morning after the crash, Marconi stood in the engineering tent with his ground crew chief, Sergeant Paolo Ricci, examining the wreckage of yet another failed engine. The Fiat RA 1000 RC41 radial engine lay disassembled on a workbench, its internal components blackened and scarred. Ricci ran his oil-stained fingers along the cylinder walls, feeling the rough texture where metal had degraded under extreme heat. "This is the fourth engine this month, Captain," Ricci said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had spent countless nights trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "The bearings are scored, the pistons are cracked. And look at this carbon buildup. It is like the fuel is burning dirty, leaving residue everywhere." Marconi picked up a damaged piston, examining the pitting along its surface. "Have you checked the fuel filters? Perhaps contamination from the storage tanks?" "Checked and rechecked, sir. The fuel comes from our supply depot in Tripoli, same as always. But something is different. The engines run hot, hotter than they should, and the detonation patterns are irregular. Sometimes we hear knocking sounds just before an engine seizes." The technical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Marco Santini, a young pilot who had transferred to Marconi's squadron 3 weeks earlier. Santini carried a worn leather journal, its pages filled with meticulous notes. He had been tracking every engine failure across the entire air group, correlating them with flight conditions, altitudes, and operational hours. "Captain, I have been analyzing the pattern," Santini said, laying his journal open on the workbench. "The failures increased dramatically above 7,000 meters and during high-stress combat maneuvers. But here is what troubles me most. Our counterparts in the German air units operating alongside us report significantly fewer engine problems with their Daimler-Benz and BMW engines." Marconi studied the data, his trained eye recognizing the pattern immediately. The correlation was undeniable. The higher the altitude and the greater the engine stress, the more catastrophic the failures became. What are the Germans doing differently? "I spoke with a Luftwaffe maintenance officer last week," Santini replied. "He mentioned their fuel specifications are more stringent. They use something called octane ratings to measure fuel quality. Our Italian fuel averages around 87 octane, while theirs exceeds 95. Ricci frowned. "Octane? What does that mean for our engines?" "It means," Santini explained, flipping to another page in his journal, "that their fuel resists pre-ignition better under compression. Our fuel ignites too early in the combustion cycle when the engine is under stress, causing what they call knock or detonation. Over time, this destroys the engine from the inside." The implications settled over the three men like a heavy blanket. For months, they had attributed their mechanical troubles to poor maintenance, battle damage, or simple bad luck. Now, a more disturbing possibility emerged. They were being systematically undermined by their own supply chain. That evening, as the North African sun painted the desert in shades of orange and crimson, Marconi composed a detailed report to Wing Headquarters outlining his concerns. He documented every failure, included Santini's statistical analysis, and requested permission to conduct a formal investigation into fuel quality standards. The response, when it arrived 3 days later, was bureaucratically dismissive. Fuel specifications met all established military standards. Engine failures were attributed to the harsh desert environment and intensive operational tempo. No further investigation warranted. But fate, as it often does in wartime, provided an unexpected opportunity. On July 3, 1942, British Commonwealth forces conducted a surprise raid on the Italian supply depot at Al Adam, 30 kilometers south of Tobruk. The raid failed to capture the depot, but in the chaos of combat, a British supply convoy was intercepted by Italian ground forces. Among the captured materials were 6,000-gallon drums of aviation fuel destined for Royal Air Force squadrons operating in the region. Marconi learned of the capture from a courier who delivered the news with almost casual indifference. Enemy fuel captured at Al Adem, available for disposal or study as needed. For Marconi, it was as if Providence had handed him the key to a locked door. Within hours, he had secured permission to examine the captured fuel, ostensibly to assess it for potential sabotage or contamination. The drums arrived at Benghazi airfield on a sweltering July morning, carried on the back of a supply truck that looked like it had survived a direct artillery hit. Ricci and his ground crew gathered around as Marconi supervised the unloading. The drums were standard military issue, painted in British desert camouflage, with stenciled markings reading 100-octane aviation fuel, specification RAF 28/41. 100 octane, Ricci whispered. Santini was right. Our fuel is not even close. Marconi crouched beside one of the drums, reading the technical specifications printed on a small metal plate riveted to its side. This fuel is designed for high-altitude operations and sustained combat stress. If what Santini told us is true, this should perform completely differently from our standard fuel. Over the next 2 days, Ricci and his crew conducted the most thorough fuel analysis their limited equipment allowed. They measured specific gravity, tested combustion characteristics in a small test chamber, and examined the fuel's color and clarity. The British fuel was noticeably clearer than their Italian equivalent, with a faint straw yellow tint compared to the darker, almost amber color of their standard supply. When burned in the test chamber, it produced a cleaner flame with less smoke and residue. But laboratory tests could only reveal so much. The true proof would come from the sky. On the morning of July 8th, Marconi made a decision that could have ended his career if it had gone wrong. He authorized Ricci to drain the fuel from his personal Machi 200 fighter and replace it entirely with the captured British fuel. The procedure took 3 hours, during which Marconi sat in the shade of the aircraft's wing, writing letters home that he hoped he would not need to send posthumously. When Ricci finally gave the signal that the aircraft was ready, Marconi climbed into the cockpit with a mixture of scientific curiosity and genuine fear. If Santini's hypothesis was wrong, if the fuel incompatibility caused an immediate engine failure, he would be the pilot spiraling into the desert with a dead engine and seconds to react. The Fiat engine roared to life with a sound that was immediately different. The usual rough edge to the engine note had smoothed out, replaced by a steady, powerful hum that resonated through the airframe. Marconi let the engine warm up longer than usual, monitoring every gauge, listening for any hint of irregularity. Everything read normal, better than normal actually. He advanced the throttle, and the Machi rolled forward with an eagerness he had not felt in months. The takeoff was smooth, the climb rate noticeably improved. At 3,000 meters, he leveled off and ran through a series of standard maneuvers, sharp turns, climbs, dives, and rolls. The engine responded with consistent power, no hesitation, no rough running, no ominous knocking sounds. Then he climbed higher. At 7,000 meters, the altitude where Italian engines typically began to struggle, the Machi was still pulling strong. Marconi pushed the aircraft into a steep climb, asking for maximum performance. 8,000 meters, 9,000 meters, 10,000 meters. The engine sang with power that seemed almost impossible. He keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Ricci, this is Marconi. I am at 10,000 meters, full throttle. Engine temperature is normal. Performance is exceptional. This fuel is not just better, it is transformative." When Marconi landed 30 minutes later, The entire ground crew was waiting on the tarmac. He climbed from the cockpit and immediately began recounting the flight, his words tumbling out in an excited rush. Ricci listened with the knowing smile of a mechanic who had suspected the truth all along. Santini took notes, already formulating the report that would need to be written, but the real proof came when they examined the engine. After such an aggressive flight, an Italian-fueled engine would have shown signs of stress, elevated temperatures, carbon buildup, and irregular wear patterns. This engine was clean, running cool, and showed no signs of detonation damage whatsoever. Over the next week, Marconi authorized additional test flights using the captured British fuel. Every pilot reported the same results: smoother engine operation, better high-altitude performance, increased reliability, and no signs of the catastrophic failures that had plagued them for months. The data was irrefutable. The British fuel was not marginally better, it was fundamentally superior. Lieutenant Giuseppe Romano, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots, conducted a particularly revealing test on July 14th. He flew 2 identical sorties, one using Italian fuel and one using British fuel, maintaining the same altitude, speed, and flight profile for both. The differences were stark. With Italian fuel, his engine ran at temperatures averaging 190 degrees Celsius, with frequent spikes above 200 degrees during high-power settings. With British fuel, temperatures remained steady at 170 degrees, even during sustained combat maneuvers. The Italian fuel flight was marked by periodic engine roughness and limited sealing, while the British fuel flight was smooth throughout, with a ceiling nearly 2,000 meters higher. Romano's report was clinical in its assessment, but devastating in its implications. "It is not that our pilots lack skill or courage," he wrote. "It is that we are fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. Every time we climb above 7,000 meters, every time we push our engines in combat, we risk catastrophic mechanical failure through no fault of our own. The enemy does not have this disadvantage." Marconi compiled all the data, test results, pilot reports, and technical analyses into a comprehensive document that ran to 47 pages. He included photographs of engine damage caused by Italian fuel versus the clean condition of engines run on British fuel. He provided statistical analysis showing the correlation between fuel quality and operational capability, and he concluded with a recommendation that was both obvious and damning. The Regia Aeronautica's fuel supply was inadequate for modern aerial combat and needed immediate upgrade to match Allied standards. The report was submitted to Wing Headquarters on July 20th, 1942. For 3 weeks, there was silence. Then, in mid-August, Marconi was summoned to a meeting with Colonel Francesco Baldini, the Regional Air Operations Commander. Marconi entered the colonel's office expecting praise for his initiative and perhaps authorization to expand the testing program. Instead, he found a man who looked like he had aged 10 years in the past month. Baldini gestured to a chair without preamble. "Sit down, Captain. We need to talk about your fuel report." Marconi sat, noting the copy of his report on the colonel's desk, heavily annotated with red ink. "You have read my findings, sir?" "I have," Baldini said wearily, "and I have forwarded them up the chain of command. Do you want to know what came back?" "Yes, sir." "Nothing." Baldini leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "Or rather, acknowledgement of receipt and a polite suggestion that we focus on tactical improvements rather than logistics. The official position is that our fuel meets specifications and that engine failures are within acceptable operational parameters." Marconi felt his jaw tighten. "Sir, with respect, my report clearly demonstrates—" "I know what your report demonstrates, Captain," Baldini interrupted. "But here is what you need to understand. Italy does not have the refinery capacity to produce high-octane aviation fuel at the scale we need. Our entire petroleum industry is built around lower-grade products. To upgrade to British standards would require rebuilding refineries, importing specialized equipment, and diverting resources we simply do not have. The people making these decisions are not ignorant. They are trapped." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Marconi finally spoke, his voice quiet. "So we just accept that our pilots will continue to face engine failures? That we will lose aircraft not to enemy action, but to our own inadequate fuel. "What choice do we have?" Baldini replied, though his tone suggested he was asking the universe rather than Marconi. "We fight with what we have, not with what we wish we had." But the data was out and it could not be unlearned. Pilots across the unit began to whisper about the captured British fuel and the dramatic performance improvements it provided. The handful of test flights had become legendary, told and retold with growing embellishment in mess halls and ready rooms. Some pilots began to view every engine failure with new suspicion, wondering if they were being sent to their defeats by their own supply chain. The psychological transformation was subtle but profound. In the pilot's mess that evening, Marconi overheard a conversation that crystallized the shifting mindset. Lieutenant Carlo Bianchi, a veteran with 23 confirmed aerial engagements, was speaking quietly to a group of younger pilots. "I used to think every engine problem was my fault," Bianchi said, stirring his coffee with a spoon that rattled against the cup. "Did I push the engine too hard? Did I maintain altitude correctly? Did I manage the throttle properly? Now I know better. We have been flying with inferior fuel, and every time we ask our engines for combat performance, we are gambling with our lives." One of the younger pilots, fresh-faced Lieutenant Alberto Conti, who had arrived at the unit only 2 weeks earlier, shook his head in disbelief. "But if the commanders know about this, if Captain Marconi's report proved it, why has nothing changed?" "Because changing it would mean admitting the problem exists," another pilot interjected, his voice bitter. "It would mean acknowledging that we are sending pilots into combat with equipment that cannot match the enemy. What commander wants to write that report?" Marconi did not join the conversation, but he listened from across the room, recognizing the anger and disillusionment in voices that had once carried confidence and pride. This was perhaps the most insidious damage caused by the fuel quality revelation, the erosion of trust between pilots and their command structure, the growing sense that they were expendable pieces in a game where the rules guaranteed their defeat. The impact extended beyond morale. Tactical decisions began to shift as pilots unconsciously adapted their flying to accommodate the fuel limitations. High-altitude intercepts were avoided when possible. Sustained combat maneuvers were cut short. Aggressive pursuit of enemy aircraft was abandoned earlier than tactical doctrine suggested. These were rational adaptations to known equipment limitations, but they cumulatively degraded Italian air effectiveness in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. In late August, Marconi flew what would become one of his most memorable sorties, not for any dramatic combat action, but for what it revealed about the cumulative stress of flying with inadequate fuel. He was leading a 4-aircraft patrol at dawn, cruising at 6,000 meters along the coastline. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited, and the Mediterranean stretched below them like a sheet of hammered bronze in the early light. His number 2, Lieutenant Santini, radioed a contact report. 4 aircraft, bearing 090, 7,000 meters, closing. Marconi scanned the sky and spotted them. British fighters, probably Spitfires, silhouetted against the rising sun. Standard tactical doctrine called for climbing to engage, using altitude advantage to dictate the terms of combat. But Marconi found himself hesitating, mentally calculating engine stress, fuel consumption, and the probability of mechanical failure if he pushed his engine to maximum power at high altitude. The hesitation lasted only seconds, but it was enough. By the time Marconi committed to the intercept, the British fighters had spotted the Italian formation and climbed to 8,000 meters, claiming the altitude advantage. The resulting engagement was brief and inconclusive, both sides exchanging fire without scoring hits before the British broke off and disappeared into the sun. But Marconi knew, with bitter certainty, that his hesitation had cost them the initiative. The British pilots had not hesitated. They trusted their engines. He no longer could. Back on the ground, he said nothing about the incident in his mission debrief. What was there to say? That he had allowed tactical considerations to be overruled by mechanical doubts. That he had effectively conceded the engagement before it began because he did not trust his own aircraft. The official record would show an inconclusive contact, but Marconi knew he had lost something more fundamental than tactical advantage. He had lost the absolute confidence required for aggressive aerial combat. In September 1942, the situation took on a darker dimension. The British offensive in North Africa intensified, and Italian air units found themselves increasingly outmatched. British Spitfires and American-made Kitty Hawks seemed to operate with impunity at altitudes where Italian fighters struggled. What had once been attributed to superior British training or aircraft design now carried an additional, more bitter explanation. The enemy simply had better fuel. Santini, who had continued his meticulous record-keeping, calculated that fuel-related engine failures accounted for approximately 23% of all Italian aircraft losses in the theatre during the summer of 1942. That was not counting the engagements that were lost, because Italian fighters could not match enemy altitude, or the pilots who avoided aggressive maneuvers out of fear their engines would fail under stress. The total impact was immeasurable, but certainly substantial. In October, Marconi received a letter from a fellow pilot stationed in Sicily. "Word of your fuel investigation has reached us here." The letter read, "We face the same problems. Engines that fail at altitude, mysterious detonations, and constant maintenance issues. Now we know why, and it is hard to accept. The British are not just better equipped or better trained. They have fundamentally better logistics. We are racing in a car with a faulty engine and wondering why we keep losing." The psychological impact of this knowledge was profound. Combat is difficult enough when you trust your equipment. When doubt creeps in, when every unusual engine sound makes you wonder if you are seconds away from a catastrophic failure, the strain becomes unbearable. Several pilots requested transfers. Others became increasingly cautious in combat, avoiding the aggressive tactics that might trigger engine stress. A few, including Marconi himself, simply became grimly fatalistic, flying their missions with the understanding that their own fuel was as much an enemy as British fighters. In December 1942, as Allied forces continued their advance across North Africa, Marconi's squadron was evacuated from Benghazi to a field near Tripoli. The captured British fuel drums, nearly empty now, were left behind. There would be no more test flights, no more comparisons. Just the grim reality of flying with fuel that everyone now knew was inadequate. The final irony came in January 1943. British forces captured the Tripoli airfield, and Marconi's squadron retreated to Sicily. In the chaos of evacuation, Marconi managed to save his research documentation, including all the test reports and pilot accounts. He carried the papers in a leather satchel through the entire retreat, somehow convinced they would matter someday. They did, though not in the way he expected. After the conclusion of the conflict in Europe, Marconi was interviewed by Allied technical intelligence officers who were conducting a comprehensive study of Axis aviation capabilities. When he produced his documentation on the fuel quality issues, the British officer conducting the interview read through it with growing interest. "You understood the problem completely," the officer said when he finished reading. "Your analysis is technically sound. The octane differential was indeed a significant factor in operational outcomes." Marconi, who had spent 3 years carrying the burden of knowledge that his own leaders had dismissed, felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. It should not have mattered. Combat should be decided by skill and courage, not by what comes out of a fuel drum. The British officer nodded slowly. Yes, it should not matter. But industrialized conflict is decided by logistics as much as tactics. Your side understood how to build beautiful aircraft and train brave pilots. But the Allies understood that the refineries and supply chains behind the front lines were just as important as the front lines themselves. That is a lesson many nations learned too late. The documentation Marconi had preserved eventually made its way into post-conflict technical assessments. The Italian fuel quality issue was noted in several official reports as a contributing factor to Axis air operations difficulties in the Mediterranean theatre. But beyond the dry language of official documents, the story became part of the oral history passed down among aviation engineers and military historians. A cautionary tale about how warfare in the industrial age is won or lost long before pilots climb into cockpits. Marconi himself returned to civilian life working as an aeronautical engineer in Milan. He never flew combat missions again, but remained involved in aviation for the rest of his life. In a 1968 interview for an Italian aviation magazine, he reflected on the fuel investigation with the perspective of decades. "We thought we were fighting a conflict in the sky," he said, "but the real battle was happening in refineries in Texas and Britain, in logistics chains stretching across oceans, in the industrial capacity to produce not just adequate fuel, but superior fuel at massive scale." The British pilot I faced in 1942 did not beat me because he was braver or more skilled. He beat me because someone in a refinery thousands of kilometers away gave him better fuel than my country could provide me. That is modern conflict. It is not romantic, it is not heroic. It is industrial, and the side with better industry wins. The technical specifications tell the story in stark numbers. Italian aviation fuel averaged 87 octane throughout most of the conflict. British fuel ranged from 95 to 100 octane. German fuel, which Italy's ally produced with more advanced refinery technology, averaged 96 octane. That gap of 8 to 13 octane points translated to dramatic differences in engine reliability, altitude capability, and combat effectiveness. An Italian Machi 200 fighter with proper high-octane fuel could match or exceed the performance of its British counterparts. With standard Italian fuel, it was consistently outperformed in critical metrics. The industrial explanation is equally telling. Britain had invested heavily in catalytic cracking technology during the 1930s, allowing its refineries to produce high-octane aviation fuel at scale. The United States brought even more advanced refinery capacity to the Allied cause when it entered the conflict. Italy, by contrast, had limited petroleum resources and relied primarily on simpler refinery techniques that could not produce high-octane fuel in sufficient quantities. The fuel quality gap was not a failure of Italian engineering or chemistry. It was the inevitable result of differential industrial development that began decades before the conflict itself. For the pilots who flew with inadequate fuel, this industrial reality translated into personal tragedy. Engine failures claimed dozens of experienced aviators who survived enemy fire only to fall victim to mechanical breakdown. Pilots who should have been competitive in combat found themselves at systematic disadvantages that no amount of skill could overcome. And when the truth about fuel quality emerged, it added a layer of psychological burden to an already desperate situation. Sergeant Ricci, the ground crew chief who had worked alongside Marconi throughout the investigation, perhaps said it best in a letter written in 1943 to his brother back in Italy. "We fix engines all day and night, working miracles with limited parts and tools, but we cannot fix the fuel. That is made far from here by people who will never see the pilots whose lives depend on it. When an engine fails and a pilot goes down, I wonder if someone in a refinery office ever knows that their production quotas and cost-cutting measures just killed someone brave and good. Probably not. That is how conflict works now. The connections between cause and effect stretch across continents, and nobody can see the whole picture. The captured British fuel that revealed this truth eventually ran out, used up in test flights and desperate combat missions. But its impact on those who experienced it lasted far longer. For Marconi and his fellow pilots, it represented both enlightenment and despair, the understanding of why they were losing, coupled with the powerlessness to change it. In the vast machinery of industrial conflict, individual knowledge mattered little against systemic disadvantages built into national infrastructure decades before. Years later, in 1974, Marconi attended an international aviation conference in London where he met squadron leader James Hartley, a retired RAF pilot who had flown Spitfires over North Africa during the same period Marconi had been based in Libya. The two men, once enemies separated by fuel quality as much as national allegiance, found themselves sharing drinks in a hotel bar and comparing their experiences. "We knew about your engine problems," Hartley said, swirling whiskey in his glass. "Our intelligence reports mentioned frequent Italian mechanical failures. We assumed it was maintenance issues, or perhaps design flaws. I never imagined it was something as fundamental as fuel quality. Most of your pilots probably never thought about what was in their fuel tanks," Marconi replied. "They just assumed it worked. We could not afford that luxury. Every flight was a calculated risk, balancing mission requirements against the probability of engine failure." Hartley was quiet for a moment, then raised his glass. To the ground crews and refinery workers, the people who won and lost the war in ways they never saw. Marconi touched his glass to Hartley's. And to the lessons we learned too late to matter. The conversation between the two former adversaries continued late into the night, touching on tactics, technology, and the fundamental asymmetries that had shaped their wartime experiences. It was a conversation that could only happen decades after the conflict, when bitterness had faded enough to allow honest reflection on how industrial capacity had determined outcomes, long before pilots ever climbed into their cockpits. The story of the captured British fuel and the investigation it sparked became something of a legend in Italian aviation circles, passed down through generations of pilots and engineers as a cautionary tale about the importance of logistics in modern conflict. It appeared in technical journals, historical analyses, and eventually in the memoirs of several pilots who had participated in the test flights. Each retelling emphasized the same uncomfortable truth, that courage and skill meant little when fundamental industrial capabilities were mismatched. In the broader context of the conflict, the Italian fuel quality issue was one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Allied industrial superiority manifested in countless ways, from aircraft production rates to electronics to replacement parts availability. But the fuel quality gap had a particular psychological impact because it was so directly measurable, so immediately evident in the performance differences pilots experienced firsthand. It was one thing to know intellectually that the enemy had more resources. It was quite another to fly the same aircraft with enemy fuel and feel the dramatic improvement in your hands. The legacy of Marconi's investigation extends beyond historical interest. Modern military logistics doctrines explicitly recognize that supply chain advantages can be as decisive as tactical superiority. The concept of fuel as a strategic weapon, first glimpsed by those Italian pilots testing captured British fuel in the desert heat of 1942, has become central to how nations plan for and conduct modern operations. Every military fuel standard, every quality control protocol, every logistics doctrine carries embedded within it the lessons learned from cases like this, that the difference between victory and defeat can be measured in octane points and refinery capacity as much as in pilot skill or tactical brilliance. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.